You're listening to the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iWalker. Flexible loans built for small businesses. iwoca.co.uk.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birnie.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel Friebe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's one of those days, is it? Yeah, how are you, chaps?
Well, I had my knuckles wrapped last week for using the Italian iteration of your name, Daniel. I thought I'd revert to the standard English pronunciation today.
Well, but surely it's classics time, so is it not Daniel van Friebos?
Oh yeah,
I don't really.
Not
really associated with the classics, am I?
No, too soft.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Who, the classics or Daniel? You're more of a classics man, Lionel, I would say. I can see you just sort of
nuggety,
thumping over the cobbles,
carrying a bit of extra weight,
wearing the cobbles down with you.
I can see
force of your riding.
I can see Napalm skulking sort of gloomily around the fields of West Flanders. Just.
Turned that into a 5-part special a couple of years ago.
I did, yeah. I was actually looking back at my first report from in the field on the cobbles, which was 2014 Tour de France, which went over some of the pavé on a very wet day. The day started with breakfast with Eddie Merckx, didn't it? And then ruined my Adidas Gazelles in the afternoon. Inappropriate footwear. So I'm not all that well equipped for the cobbles on every occasion, but do my best.
Well, here we are with another cycling podcast in which what are we doing today, chaps? What's on the menu?
Well, you're the boss, Rich, but I think we're going to be talking about.
You've been paying attention.
Well, we're going to be talking about Paris-Roubaix, aren't we? Of course, it would be Paris-Roubaix week this week. It's not, for obvious reasons, and I think we're going to also be talking about the iteration of the Tour of Flanders that we watched. I think we all watched it, didn't we? A couple of days ago.
Yeah. We did. Well, coming up later on, we've got François Thomazeau with a very appropriate song for Paris-Roubaix. We're going to hear from Steve Bauer, the Canadian rider, talking about what we always think of as the closest ever Paris-Roubaix, but Daniel might have a different view on that. We've got a bit from Luca Guercilena, the Trek-Segafredo boss, but also more famously Daniel's former coach.
I spoke about exactly that with him this morning. We discussed this is an episode that hopefully you'll all hear during the Giro d'Italia, but we talked about whether he'd made a big mistake by not recommending me for the Mapei, their World Tour team in 2001. Whether it's a regret that he still lives with. Whether
the idea of coaching Daniel.
Spoiler alert, he doesn't.
Goodness me, the idea of coaching Daniel. I mean that's like trying to herd one cat, isn't it?
I mean, it's an oxymoron, isn't it? The idea of coaching Daniel. Poor old Luca Guercilena. I'm surprised he managed to continue working in cycling. But anyway, he's done very well. We'll hear again from Lockdown Larry Warbass out there in the US. We'll hear the latest from Larry. And we're going to hear from Charlie Quarterman, a young British rider on Trek-Segafredo, who made a decent start to his professional career this year, didn't he, Lionel, before the season came to a stop?
Very much so, yeah. Raced very well at the Tour de la Provence and ended the first stage with a couple of jerseys, and then was at the UAE Tour, and now, like all of us, is mixing up a little bit of training outdoors with some indoor training. But yeah, we'll hear from him in the final part.
Speaking of indoor training, chaps, I rode the Tour of Flanders on Sunday with Philippe Gilbert. Don't know about you guys, don't know what you've been up to, but that's what I've been up to.
Who won?
Did I say it was a race? It was.
Oh right,
it was just a fun
poodle.
ride.
Oh right,
it wasn't a poodle.
Just a mince.
If you have a look at my stats on Strava, you'll see it certainly wasn't a poodle.
E-mincing, I think they call it.
Oh goodness. Goodness.
Anyway, first time I'd done anything like that, I must admit.
What did you make of it?
I mean, it was. I think it's something you get more out of the more you do it and understand how it works. I was listening back to, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, the French special from a couple of years ago with Mat Hayman, where he trained a lot on Zwift in the build-up to winning Paris-Roubaix, and he talked about the sense of community that he had on that. So I think I'm not familiar enough yet with the technology and how it works to really feel that, but I think, from the point of view of giving some kind of structure to your training and giving you a time to, that you have to, like meeting people for a ride, isn't it? If the ride starts at 5, you got to be there at 5, and that's quite useful when it comes to indoor training, I think, if nothing else.
The idea of you grappling with this technology, I've just got an image of a sort of granddad unboxing his first Betamax video in the 80s and trying to work out how to get the picture to appear on the screen.
It's not quite as bad as that. But have you been doing any indoor cycling, Lionel?
I have been doing a bit, yeah. The weather's been nice, so it's been possible to sort of throw open the back door of my office and look out at the sunshine rather than look at a screen. So I've just been doing enough, really, just to keep my mind straight.
Keep the engine running. Keep the engine running.
It's been a tricky few days, if I'm honest. Yesterday was like descending the Kemmelberg, the old way round, the 20% downhill on cobbles, morale-wise. Today's been a bit better. Feel a bit like rolling out in the neutralised zone in the sunshine.
I can hear from the tone of his voice, he's metaphorically trudging through those Flandrian fields, looking very gloomy.
Yeah, frowning.
Descending the Kemmelberg with a rear wheel puncture. just managing to stay upright.
That was yesterday, but today much better. I'm kind of freewheeling out of the neutralised zone, enjoying the sun.
Before we get on to Paris-Roubaix, we did all watch, I think, the virtual Tour of Flanders on Sunday that was won by Greg van Avermaet. What did you make of it? It was, I think we understand there was a lot of work went into it. That it was, as these things go, pretty impressive. Although watching it, I imagined in the future, in 20, 30 years, that these avatars will be almost hard to tell apart from the actual people. I think as the technology improves, we'll watch virtual versions of the riders themselves, and it might in the long term be hard to tell the reality from the fictionalized version apart.
I think it's easy to be cynical and negative about these things, isn't it? But the organisers of Flanders Classics deserve huge credit for putting something like that together, and it's not easy for lots of reasons. But one of those reasons is that the teams and riders, they all have agreements, or a lot of the teams and riders have agreements with different digital platforms, and so it's difficult to get them all together. And they did that. They assembled a really good field. The actual notion of the sort of sport or e-sport itself, I think we've spoken about before, is not necessarily for me. I think the way I explained it before was, if you think of your interest and what has attracted you to cycling as a sort of pie chart, it's made up of different things for different people. For me, the landscapes are important, the history is important, also the glamour is important, and I think there's something about sort of seeing Mike Toynerson on a turbo trainer.
Say his washing machine.
Well, yeah.
His washing machine was glamorous.
Well, no, I don't know. Was anyone in front of a washing machine? In my head, I can see these guys in their sort of laundry rooms, and there's a box of Daz perched on the washing machine, and this is access. This is great. You get to see behind the sort of curtain into their real lives. I don't particularly like it because I find that it sort of demystifies the stars of the sport in the same way, or in the opposite way, to how sort of mystique used to be created. If you think about the sort of the Hollywood film stars of the golden era of Hollywood. I mean, one of the reasons why they became, or they had the pull that they did, was that people never saw them except for in those films, or you might see them on the front of a newspaper. And the same applied to the great cyclists of Fausto Coppi in the 50s, and very similar. The only exposure people would have to Fausto Coppi would be in the few pictures that sort of leaked out, and then on the radio, and you could sort of project onto what you heard and what you saw, pretty much whatever you wanted, and they became these mythical, godlike, untouchable figures. And it's very different when you're watching someone on a sort of fairly grainy Skype screen or whatever it was, FaceTime screen, and their sort of girlfriends walking past in a zebra print onesie, and
it's not hardly the white lady, is it?
Well, exactly. I mean, imagine if the white lady, if you'd saw her in the Fausto was there on his Zwifting, and you'd seen the white lady in a zebra print onesie, say, Fausto, how many times have I told you, pick your boxer shorts up off the bathroom floor? I mean, it would have. Would we still think in the same way about Fausto Coppi?
But wasn't the stuff in the background the most revealing thing? I mean, we had Thomas de Kent with his extreme tidiness and order. We had Remco Evenepoel outdoors under a carport. Tim Wellens with loads of Lotto Soudal logos behind him. Nicholas Roach looked like he had something like Lord of the Rings on the TV behind him.
Oliver Nassen in an underground car park.
He was in a concrete bunker. And Greg van Avermaet had his blue bedsheet covering the window, presumably keeping the sunshine out, which wasn't terribly glamorous looking, but it was that was the little insight that I took. I couldn't, as soon as they flashed to the riders and their setups, that was what I was looking at more so than the action on the screen, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't the Nibali setup, was it, with the Giro trophy behind, the Tour de France trophy and various other mementos from his career, which we saw a couple of weeks ago. I quite enjoy these little glimpses into people's real lives, but I know what you mean, Daniel. We should give the results, shouldn't we? I mean, Greg van Avermaet won his first Tour of Flanders. Oliver Nassen was second. Nicholas Roach third. Thomas de Gent fourth. A bad day for De Koning and Quick-Step. They'll be hoping to get back onto real roads, I think. Remco Evenepoel was their best in sixth, and Zdenek Stybar 10th. Yves Lampaert 11th.
It was the kind of performance by De Koning which made you wonder what Wilfred Peters was doing on Sunday afternoon. Was he
sitting on the driveway in the car with the engine idling?
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of Wilfred Peters because I've been working my way through the behind-the-scenes Tour of Flanders documentaries, which are about an hour and 15 long. And I talked last week about the 2018 one, Nicky Terpstra. They're all brilliant, and I think a lot of people have been discovering these over the last week or so. They are fantastic. They really capture the chaos of the day, and the way that it's pieced together with all these multiple cameras and different team cars with different parents, with fans, with riders. It's just brilliant. So if you've not discovered them yet, go and have a look.
Before we hear from the Lockdown Tour of Flanders winner, Greg van Avermaet, just another couple of things on the race. What happened to Michael Matthews? We didn't really find out. Did he just give up, or did his Wi-Fi drop out?
Not sure.
Not sure, no. And also the Quadamont wasn't cobbled on the graphics, which was slightly disappointing. Shouldn't nitpick, really, considering the work that went into putting this on. But cobbles need to be realised in some way. I know, of course, you can't really ride cobbles on an indoor trainer, can you?
Not yet.
Not
but
yet.
I'm sure that'll come.
Do you think one day there'll be some kind of device that will send some vibrations through the forks and up to the handlebars?
You can steer now, can't you, on Zwift, maybe on other applications as well, for some parts. So that technology will certainly come. It maybe already exists and we don't know about it. I don't know. Someone will tell us.
Just a quick brief interruption here from producer Adam, just to tell the guys that this technology does already exist, as I'm sure many of you listeners already know. In particular, the Tax Neo series of smart trainers all have road feel that includes the simulation of riding over cobblestones. Back to the podcast.
Well, shall we hear from the winner, Greg van Avermaet? Richard, you've already opened the can of worms describing him as the Tour of Flanders winner. I mean, what will the future say? Will it say 2020 Greg van Avermaet in the list of Palmares?
No, it won't, and it doesn't. It's not listed on Pro Cycling Stats. Therefore, it doesn't really count, does it?
Fair enough.
Yeah, it was hard. I think. Yeah, I tried to do as good as possible, and I actually didn't know what to expect either, and what I can say, I just tried to follow the guys in the first minutes of the race. And then then I knew it was a little bit advantageous to catch some wheels. And then in the end, it was good, I think, to go to try something on the Paris-Roubaix, because I heard also from the guys that it would be good on the climbs to make the difference, because on the flat it would be really hard. And as soon as I had a gap, I tried to try as good as possible to the finish, and I think it worked out. I just tried to do as good as possible. I don't like to ride inside anyway, and so we were lucky still in Belgium to ride outside, and for this I think also kept my condition better than the other ones, because riding every day inside for sure it doesn't help that much. So just try to build up the bike as good as possible yesterday, because normally I have my time trial bike on the rollers, and I think I did a good session this morning just to see everything works. Was really important, I think, and then just see how far I can come. But like I said, I had no idea to how this should work. You know, if it's the first time, you don't know what to expect. But it was really hard, especially from the start on the Kruisberg. I was dropped one time. Luckily, I could make it back, and then I could come into the race a little bit better, especially with small climb. It helped me, I think, to make a gap. It's quite crazy. In Belgium, everybody was watching, I think. That's quite special. Even after I won, my girlfriend was saying a lot of people were in front of my house cheering. So that's you see how big cycling is in Belgium, and in general, I think it's really nice to see this. But I also don't want to make too much big of a victory out of this. You know, it was nice entertainment, but hopefully we are soon back on the road and feel the real climbs.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iWalker. Flexible loans built for small businesses. Join 50,000 customers taking on life's twists and turns and scaling new heights with iWalker. If you run a business, find out more at iwalker.co.uk, iwoca.co.uk.
I'm Ben Granger. I'm 19 years old. I'm a member of Kendal Cycle Club. Last year I was 6th in the Welsh National Road Race Championships and 12th at Rydale Grand Prix. I'd been after a Strava comp held by James Knox out of Brigsteer for quite a while that I took recently, a kilometre at 11%, which was a pretty hard effort, which is a road we often use on the club rides. James responded on Strava, giving me a bit of credit for the effort, which was quite nice and rewarding for the effort I'd put in. As somebody who's young and from the Kendal area, it's really inspiring to have James to show that people from the Kendal area can make it sort of all the way to the top. It's really motivating to see what he's achieved already.
A big thank you to our headline sponsor, iWalker, whose support helps to ensure that we can carry on as normal as possible at this strange time. As well as supporting us, they also sponsor the Kendal Cycle Club, and we heard from one of their young members just there. iWalker remains 100% focused on their mission to provide customers with the finance they need to bridge cash flow gaps and make investments.
Living easy, living free. Season to the kid on a one-way ride. Asking nothing, leave me be. Taking everything in my stride. Don't need reason, don't need rhyme. Ain't nothing I would rather do. Going down, party time. My friends are gonna be there too. I'm on the highway to hell. Highway to hell. The highway to hell. Highway to hell. No stop signs, speed limit. Nobody's gonna slow me down. Like a wheel, gonna spin it. nobody's gonna mess me around. It's silent, paid my dues, playing in a rocking band. Hey mama, look at me, I'm on my way to the promised land. I'm on the highway to hell, highway to hell, highway to hell, highway to hell.
Well, guys, this is François Thomazeau. I was thinking, because of Paris-Roubaix, the hell of the north, this was, quite an obvious one, highway to hell, especially since an Australian, Mat Hayman, won it a couple of years back, so I wanted to pay an homage to both the hell of the north, of course, AC/DC, and, our good friend Mat Hayman. I think everybody loves this guy, and so a little bit of Australian rock and roll for you guys for this podcast. Okay, well, we're looking forward to the next one. Cheers, guys. Bye.
Change of pace there from François Thomazeau in this week's song, and it's been one of the highlights of the lockdown the last few weeks. François' weekly song on the podcast and daily song that he's been posting on social media. But Highway to Hell there for Paris-Roubaix week. Did you enjoy that?
Originally sung by AC/DC?
Absolutely, and so it was his homage to sort of Mat Hayman's win 2016 and obviously Paris-Roubaix, the hell of the north.
AC/DC, wasn't that the famous amateur club in Paris?
Well, actually, but it strikes me that about half of AC/DC's discography could be dedicated to Paris-Roubaix, because they did a Hell's Bells, they did High Voltage, Dirty Deeds, Hard as a Rock,
Carrefour de l'Arbre.
No, they didn't do that.
Forest of Arenberg.
And then the power ballad, Sprint in the Velodrome.
And then of course Sink the Pink, which was about the Giro d'Italia. No, you shook me all. How could I forget? You shook me all night long. I mean, that would have made a perfect soundtrack, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Francois, for sending in your song, and looking forward already to next week's song. But Paris-Roubaix, well, it would have been on Sunday, wouldn't it? And it's too early to tell, but some are already speculating that it would have been rainy. It will be rainy on Sunday. The forecast is for rain on Sunday, is what I'm trying to say. And we haven't had a rainy Paris-Roubaix when was the last one? Was it the Service Canavan win? Was that the last wet Paris-Roubaix?
That was 2001, wasn't it? 2002 was also wet.
Right.
It was, with Museo winning ahead of Tom Boonen.
Yeah.
But, I mean... there's
speculating about weather that might have affected a race that now isn't going on. I mean, that just makes my head spin. I can't cope with that speculation.
But there's a bit of a fetishization of bad weather and Paris-Roubaix, but I'm not necessarily that attached to the idea of wet Paris-Roubaix being better than dry ones. I mean, I kind of think that Paris-Roubaix is one of the few races which, even if you watch on TV, one thing that's transmitted, communicated clearly and well is the speed. And that comes across much better when it's dry. And, if I think of classic editions, a lot of them are, they did end with someone coming over the line, whether it's a Franco Ballerini or someone else, with their face covered in dust rather than muck.
Well, when we chatted yesterday, the three of us, we agreed on one classic edition, and it was a wet one, one of the toughest ones in recent memory. And I think we're going to just hear a little montage from the 1994 Paris-Roubaix now.
Oh là là, oh Duclos aussi, Duclos la salle victime d'une crevaison également, Duclos et Ballerini dans la même galère, Franco Ballerini et Gilbert Duclos la salle victime d'une crevaison, et devant les autres s'en vont, Johan Museo et Fabio Baldato, les deux hommes avec une roue crevée qui tentent de revenir.
Up in front, it looks like Duke Lascelles selling it, and Duke Lascelles got trouble, he's punctured as well, Duke Lascelles' arms gone up, oh this is terrible, both of them have punctured the two-star men now, and there's no help at hand, no motorcycles, no cars, no help. They've been riding now since 10 o'clock this morning, some 6.5 hours of
Et
anguish.
Tchmil s'est envolé. Il est écœuré, Johan Museeuw. Il est battu à la régulière. 40 secondes d'écart. C'est un exploit qu'est en train de réaliser Tchmil. On va vous laisser savourer avec lui cet immense succès. Non, Tchmil n'est pas un petit vainqueur de Paris-Roubaix. Il est venu très tard au très haut niveau. Mais son palmarès de début de saison en atteste. La fin de course, la manière dont il a mis à mal la contre-attaque de Johan Museeuw en atteste. Oui, Tchmil, c'est un grand vainqueur de Paris-Roubaix.
Well, that was a little flavour of the 1994 Paris-Roubaix, a classic edition, and won by Andrei Tchmil, which is another reason why we were talking about it yesterday, wasn't it, Daniel?
Well, it was, Rich, because just a couple of days ago, Andrei Tchmil sadly announced or wrote on his, I think it was on his Facebook page, that he's been suffering from cancer. He's 57 years old now, and no, he didn't really give any prognosis, but he talks about it as his next sort of big battle, his next big race that he's going to try to win, and we hope he does win it. But Tchmil was an intriguing character, and particularly sort of in the context of that 94 Paris-Roubaix, and you know, people always talk about the battle with Museeuw, but you know, as we heard in that clip, and there was a lot more to that race and a lot more that made it special and memorable than just Museeuw versus Tchmil. I mean, we heard there the commentary from the late David Duffield when Duclos-Lassalle, Gilbert Duclos-Lassalle, who had won the previous two Paris-Roubaix, he punctured, and Franco Ballerini also punctured, and those two, the previous year in 1993, had this incredibly close finish. And in fact, we talked earlier about how close the Steve Bauer and Eddie Planckaert one was in 1990, and I think it was written at the time that what separated them was 13 millimeters, and I think Duclos-Lassalle and Ballerini, it was 8 millimeters, supposedly, reportedly. But anyway, Tchmil, Museeuw, Duclos-Lassalle and Ballerini, they were some of the main protagonists in 1994, but Tchmil really outclassed everyone, rode away, and it was wet, and it was sort of epic in that sense. There was a long portion of the race where there were no motorbike cameras. The only shots were from the helicopter because the motorbike pilots had various problems. They'd gone off the road in the mud and so on. It was a bit like, when you watch it back, it's a bit like sort of following the dots. If you follow the dots now on like the transcontinental race or one of these, you know, ultra endurance cycling.
Although, yeah, you say that, Daniel. I watched it yesterday actually, and you do get, there are some shots where the landscape allows it, where it's a bit like the shot that we get on the Champs-Élysées alongside the riders. There are bits where we can see Ballerini in particular. He attacked pretty hard just before the puncture, and we see this beautiful shot of him side on riding across the cobbles.
We do, but as I said, Tchmil was, I think, you know, quite clearly the strongest on the day, and it was a sort of victory for the underdog because he'd moved to Lotto, the Belgian team Lotto, that season. The previous year, Andrei Tchmil had been at GBMG with Museeuw, but had felt there that he wasn't really given enough consideration. That was a Belgian team, and Patrick Lefevre was in charge, and Johan Museeuw was sort of his protege, and Tchmil wasn't picked for Milan-San Remo, and then at the end of the year, Tchmil, whose various changes of nationality we'll probably come on to, but he was riding for Moldova in the World Championships in Oslo, but it was widely expected, and certainly Lefevre expected, that he was going to help Museeuw in the World Championships. Museeuw, of course, he was riding for Belgium. Tchmil didn't do that, and this was either compounded or led to their falling out, and Tchmil then moving to Lotto. But Lotto were a smaller outfit than GBMG. Museeuw had won the Tour of Flanders in '93, so he was already a big figure in Belgium and in the classics. And the favourite really coming into the '94 Paris-Roubaix.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the changes of Tchmil's nationality, Daniel. He obviously was a relatively late starter when it comes to professional cycling, because of course until 1989 he wasn't really allowed to be a professional. Well, he wasn't allowed to be a professional. It wasn't until 89 when the Alfa Lum team was able to race professionally. It was kind of an Italian/Russian outfit, wasn't it? And by that stage, Tchmil was already 26, and so by 94 he was 31 years old, and not the most experienced in terms of winning races at the very top level. I mean, that Paris-Roubaix was really the first of a handful of really big wins that he managed to get in his career.
Yeah, and you mentioned there him starting his pro career late. I mean, he was born way over on the east side of Russia, almost. I mean, not very far as the crow flies from Japan. I think his mum was an opera singer. Anyway, the family had moved to Ukraine when he was younger, and then obviously, what is now Ukraine, then the Soviet Union, and then as the Soviet Union started to fall apart in the late 80s, there was this idea took root, and I think they called it Project, it had a code name, Project Sea Serpent. The Russian or the Soviet Federation had come up with this plan to sort of place their riders in Europe, and this led to the creation of the Alfa Lum team in San Marino. I think Alfa Lum made aluminium or worked with aluminium, and this came to fruition, and these Russians all came over, and they couldn't really communicate with the Italians, and there was even a story, I think in their first year before the 1990 season, Tchmil himself and one other rider got in trouble because they came back to the team hotel through the window at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, when the rest of the team were at breakfast, and they'd been out all night sort of sampling the delights of wherever they were. I think they were somewhere on the Adriatic coast, Rimini, they got a bit of a bad reputation, some of those guys, for being playboys, for wanting to sort of take and embrace everything that the West had to offer. But Tchmil certainly, in a very short space of time, got his act together and became known as a really sort of disciplined, hard rider. The rivalry with Musée was really built up. I think in the Belgian press, Tchmil always said that more was made of it than was actually sort of going on the road and on a personal level between him and Musée. But he did always used to say that he kept a poster of Musée on the wall in his garage, and he would use it to motivate himself. And it was a life-size poster. And then when he was on his turbo trainer, particularly when it was wet outside, and he would sort of imagine being in the classics, and he would imagine riding against Musée. And he later moved house. This was when he was sort of living in Belgium, and he moved house and went to Italy, Lake Garda, where he lived for a long time. And he took the poster with him and put it up in his garage again. But when I think of Tchmil, I also always think of Jef Braeckevelt. Did either of you ever come into contact with Jef Braeckevelt?
No.
Napalm?
Well, yeah, as a long-term sports director at Lotto Soudal, and passed away about this time last year.
Correct. And he was one of these rare direct sportifs who had never been a rider himself. He'd been a sort of cycling fanatic growing up in the 60s in Belgium, and he used to brag that he'd become a director sportif at the age of 15. There was some sort of local club that he'd become involved with, and he'd moved through all sorts of teams and made it his life and made it his job. He was one of these real sort of institutions of Belgian cycling. I mean, a big guy, big white-haired guy. He was sort of pudgy kind of, but very tall. He kind of reminded me a bit of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. And then he had a very memorable, not in a particularly good way, handshake. His handshake was kind of like, it was sort of trying to grasp an uncooked quail or partridge that's been out of the fridge. You didn't really. It was very fleshy, but it was inert. It didn't really move, and you couldn't. And you didn't really know how to get your hands around it.
I get that a lot with partridges and quails.
This is a new segment, Daniel, is it? After social distancing, we're going to have handshakes with Daniel Friebe.
yeah. But there are some very memorable handshakes. I always remember, and I think I tweeted about this when he died, but Raymond Poulidor had extraordinary hands. Very sort of stubby but huge fingers. Short fingers, but a really very strong, firm handshake. But that wasn't Jef Braeckevelt at all. Jef Braeckevelt's was not a particularly pleasant handshake. But as a young journalist, sort of around 2001, 2002, I used to speak to him at races, and it always struck me. But what I didn't realise at that point was what a sort of sage he was in Belgian cycling, and he was at Lotto for many years, and then he was thought of so highly by Tchmil, who was involved at Katusha later, and also Robbie McEwen, who was involved at Katusha later, that they brought him on board there. But as I say, he was this sort of Yoda guru figure in Belgian cycling, and I remember another real sort of authority on Belgian cycling is our colleague Hugo Korwitz. Hugo is this sort of unmistakable. He's quite small, Hugo, isn't he? Wears sort of bottle top round glasses, but quite dark skinned. He looks as though he could be Mexican, but he is, as I say,
pay attention,
unmistakable.
Pay attention.
Great character, fantastic character. Anyway, I was going for I think it was a race or some kind of job, an interview a few years ago in Belgium, and I discussed arrangements with Hugo, and he'd very kindly offered to let me stay at his house when I arrived. And I was getting in, I think, probably on the Eurostar quite late one evening, and he was going to pick me up from the train station, I think probably Waregem or somewhere like that. And anyway, I got in Hugo's car, and he said, "Friebe, pay attention, I must call Jef." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What do you mean?" And he gave me no context, there was no preamble, and he just started dialing this number. And anyway, all then I heard for the next sort of 15 minutes, as you always do when you're listening to Belgians talk about cycling, was just a series of grunts, just Jef, allez, good, huh? And this went on and on, but I just kept hearing, there were a couple of words I could make out. I could make out the names of riders, and then he kept saying this thing, Muska. The voice on the other end. Anyway, the call ended, and I said, "Hugo, what was that?" And he goes, "It's Jef." I said, "Well, what do you mean, Jef?" And he goes, "Yeah, Jef Braeckevelt. I call him every night." And this was it was about 10:20 at night, and you could tell that Jef Braeckevelt was in a horizontal position. He was lying down, and I said, "What, you phone him every night when he's in bed?" He goes, "Yeah, of course, always." And I said, "What about this?" I said, "What for?" And he says, "You know everything, Jef. You just to hear, Friebe, pay attention. You need to, Jef, he knows everything that's happening in cycling." And I said, "What about this Mushka? What was that?" He goes, "Yeah, that is Jeff's wife." And I said, "What? So you were having this 20-minute conversation about the current affairs in professional cycling at 10:20 in the evening? Meanwhile, his wife was lying next to me." Of course, Friebe." And I'll never forget this. And but then I started to probe and interrogate Hugo to try and understand just how this had happened, that Jef Braeckevelt had become this sort of totemic figure in Belgian cycling, and he explained then that such was the regard in which Jef Braeckevelt was held by other director sportifs and riders, that the day before the Tour of Flanders, every year there was almost a queue outside Jef Braeckevelt's house of director sportifs that would visit Jef at home, and he would sort of lick his finger and stick it in the air and say, "Right, tomorrow Cancellara attacks with 15 kilometers to go," or tomorrow Hayman is in the move with De Volder, and they would all sort of nod solemnly and go off and come up with their tactics for the Tour of Flanders based on what Jef Braeckevelt had told them.
I'm not sure how we moved from the 1994 Paris-Roubaix into that, but it was very entertaining.
Well, Braeckevelt was, Tchmil was like a son for him. I should also add that Tchmil was probably the most intimidating guy to interview I've ever had the experience of interviewing. I interviewed him when he was the Katusha manager. 2009, they were opening their service course somewhere near Lake Garda, and I was doing a big feature with Pippo Pozzato. Of
course you were.
And I also, of course, and we had lunch at this Italian trattoria, and Makarov was there, and anyway, I had lunch with Pozzato, and then I got 20 minutes with Tchmil afterwards, and for 20 minutes he did not look me in the eye once.
What I'd like to know, Daniel, is who, if anybody, has replaced Braeckevelt. I mean, who's in that role now in Belgian cycling? Who does Hugo Kurvitz call every night?
I don't know. I'd love to know, but I'm sure Hugo misses him, and he misses those calls. I should also add that I did establish what this Muska was. Well, Muska was Jef Braeckevelt's wife, but Muska was not her name. And Muska means little mouse in Dutch, and that was his term of affection, endearment for his wife. But it was very incongruous. This huge Hulk giant of a man, very gruff, who knew everything about Belgian cycling, whose protege was like the hardest sort of Flahout, Flandrien type rider, and
married to a little mouse.
He was like married to a little mouse.
Big Bear and Little Mouse.
Oh,
exactly.
Lionel, what do you have any? I mean, we're going to hear from Steve Bauer in the next part, who you spoke to recently about the 1990 edition. I know that's a race that you covered quite extensively over the years. Are there any other editions of Paris-Roubaix that stand out for you?
Well, just going to pick up on 94 and Tchmil's win and just contrast it. Daniel, you made the point about the weather and the impact that it has on the race. That year, 94, Tchmil crossed the line in 7 hours, 28 minutes, 2 seconds, average speed 36.1 kilometres an hour. The following year, Franco Ballerini won in 6 hours, 27 minutes, 5 kilometres quicker, 5 kilometres an hour quicker and an hour quicker. I mean, it just shows that the conditions really do dictate when it comes to Paris-Roubaix. I'm not sure that there's quite the same discrepancy when you come to look at the finishing times in other races. Maybe I'm possibly just talking off the top of my head there, but it does seem that the race is characterised by the wind conditions particularly, and whether or not it's wet. And I agree with you, whoever made the point earlier about the editions where there's a tailwind are often among the most exciting until the elastic snaps, and then the result is no longer in doubt. I mean, if you think back to 2007 when Stuart O'Grady won from basically being in the early break, I mean that kind of thing can happen in an edition of Paris-Roubaix. Really, it's the one race of the year where there isn't a pattern that you can say, oh, this is what happens every year. I know I say it about the Tour of Flanders in that there's that kind of advanced move, isn't there, with sort of 70 kilometres to go, and then from 40 kilometres to go you start thinking about what's going to happen in the denouement. Whereas in Paris-Roubaix, really, there are editions that stand out, and you can say that completely surprise winners have thoroughly deserved it on their day, but stand out in the record books as surprise winners. I'm thinking sort of, I don't know, Frédéric Guédon in 1997, or even O'Grady's win in 2007.
Well, can I single out Mat Hayman's win in 2016 as well? I mean, Francois mentioned it earlier on, and that was a very fast edition, 5 hours 50, almost 44 kilometres an hour. And it really was a race where Hayman was off the front almost the whole race. And one of the reasons for that was because of his lack of confidence in his condition. You know, he was in a slightly different role. He was on the front foot from the start of that race and ended up winning it. And I listened back to the French special that we did with him this morning. That was basically a year later at Paris-Nice. I went and met him, and we watched the final 20 kilometres of the race again together, and he talked me through it and what was going on. And it was just fascinating to get the insight, but also it was the first time he'd watched it back, and he was clearly imagining himself in those positions again and realising things about how he was racing that he perhaps hadn't realised at the time. He was in a 4-man break with Tom Bonen, Edvald Boasson-Hagen and Ian Stannard in the end. He sort of survived with these riders, having, as I said, been away all day. And, he was watching what he was doing and realising that he wasn't just going for the podium or just going for top 4 once he was there. There was a moment where we watched him having attacked, then switch off a bit and move into the wheels again. Where he said, if I'm thinking here that if I'd been going for the podium, I'd have kept going, but somewhere deep inside, I felt like I might have a chance, and that was almost quite illuminating for him as well. There's a great moment in commentary, because the commentary of Mat Keenan and Robbie McEwen forms quite an important part of that episode as well, where Mat Keenan says Mat Hayman has won 2 professional races, Tom Bonan 109. So it was a real kind of mismatch, but of course Mat Hayman won in the velodrome, and he was surprised, shocked, thought there'd been a mistake. He was also worried. He lived in Belgium, and he was worried that it would make him hugely unpopular in Belgium, because he'd beaten Tom Bonan, who was going for, I think, his 5th Paris-Roubaix, wasn't he? But I'd single that out as one of the classic editions of the race, I think. Because it's so quick, you can really watch quite a lot of it. And, it's a great race to watch as it unfolds, and it shows the benefits of really getting on the front foot and getting up the road early and surviving once the big favourites catch you up.
The debate about the best edition or the most spectacular edition is one thing, and it's one that people have that on a regular basis, but so is the debate about who's the greatest Paris-Roubaix rider of all time. I mean, there are some pretty impressive candidates. Roger de Vlamingh and Tom Boonen hold the record 4 times each, but would you chaps go along with those two as the best ever, or who would be the other candidates in your eyes?
You know Roger de Vlamingh better than I do, Daniel. How often, because Bonan also, went close on several occasions and had teammates like Nicky Terpstra win, perhaps because Bonan was his teammate. So Bonan's record in that race was, I'm going to look it up now, but did de Vlamingh have a lot of podiums in Paris-Roubaix as well?
Well, he certainly did, Rich. He was second, I'm looking now, 4 times, third once, and then, he never finished outside the top 7 in Paris-Roubaix. In fact, in I think 12 appearances, or 13 appearances, never finished outside the
wow. Well,
7.
Bonan had 8 top 6s in Paris-Roubaix, so de Vlamingh maybe gets the nod then on that basis, does he?
I would say so, Rich. I think he believes that he is the best Paris-Roubaix rider of all time. Famously, he also used to get very irked when Boonen was closing in on his record, that people should even mention them in the same breath. I think he started to make peace now with the fact that he sits equal with Tom Boonen on top of the pile. But bit of Roger de Vlamingh news, actually. I don't know if you remember last year, he was quite ill. He had a nasty bacterial infection of some kind, and I'm not sure whether his life was in danger, but he was certainly quite badly ill. I think he's recovered now. He also had some problems in his personal life. We've spoken on numerous occasions about Roger de Vlamingh's personal life before, and he split up with his longtime partner, but he's got a new girlfriend. The good news is her name is Peggy. Roger de Vlamingh is 72. Peggy is 45, so that's 3 years younger than Roger de Vlamingh's daughter. And Peggy was actually the lady who called the ambulance last year when he had when he first was suffering from symptoms of that infection that I mentioned.
Well, best wishes to Monsieur Paris-Roubaix. Who's your top Paris-Roubaix rider, Lionel?
Sean Kelly.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Home win there, Sean Kelly.
But
yeah.
We've not mentioned
no,
Cancellara.
but you spoke to somebody. Well, I mentioned already. You spoke to your old coach, didn't you, Daniel?
I did. My coach and Fabian Cancellara's coach, Luca Guercilena, who is now the team manager, principal, the big boss at Trek-Segafredo, and I asked him to make the case for Cancellara as the best Paris-Roubaix rider of all time.
I say that Fabian was probably, for the new generation, I can make comparison with the old generation, but with the new generation for sure was the best rider for the classics, Paris-Roubaix included. I think was the highest expression of power. I think that was Fabian. someone that can let's pass me the term, kill himself on training to be really, really, really ready on the race day. And I spent with him so much time working on motor pacing and training that I can say that for sure, that I never saw anyone do does such intensity on training just to be sure to be ready on the Sunday race. The last big training was the Tuesday before Flanders, because then between Flanders and Roubaix we normally take it a bit easy. In a couple of time we raced Calde Price, and in another couple of time we made a long training session on Thursday, but was never less than 6 hours anyway. So I believe that there were the good blocks, and I remember having him making huge efforts on a climb before the classics period, and finishing even with after 7 hour enough with sprints at more than 1,600 watts. So I think that that's our numbers that clearly said what Fabian was able to do. An opponent to beat Fabian should have put us, the team, in trouble, and have Fabian totally isolated with more than half race to go. Because if you was ending up 1-1, the possibility to lose was close to 98%, I think. So I think that's they try even in Flanders, even in Roubaix many times to just isolate Fabian, but at the end he came out still to be the strongest, especially when the whole winter was good. I think was almost unbeatable.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thank you very much indeed to Science and Sport for their support of the Cycling Podcast. And you can still get 25% off all your Science and Sport products at scienceandsport.com with the code SISCP25, SISCP25. If you're training indoors, don't forget that Science and Sport produce a range of products that can help you with your indoor training as well. I'm actually, I've got a load. I'm looking here at shelves of Science and Sport products. I've been sent quite a few new products that Science and Sport are bringing out over the next few weeks. Can't talk about them yet, but I will do in the coming weeks. And I've been, well, rather embarrassingly, I got the bonk on the turbo trainer last week, and I had to stuff my face with a new product, and I can confirm it was very effective in staving off said bonk, and I survived and finished my session in one piece. It didn't crumple to the floor. So anyway, talk a bit more about that when the product's available. But get 25% off your Science and Sport products at scienceandsport.com. We heard from Luca Guercilena just before the break there on Fabian Cancellara. I was in the Velodrome in 2010 when Cancellara launched that big, long 50-kilometer attack to win there. That was him really at the very zenith of his powers.
The much debated long-range attack.
It was much debated.
The subject of rumours to this day.
Yeah, although Bonin did something very similar then, didn't he? The following year, was it? No. What year? 2012, was it? The Bonin?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that was 2 years later,
Yeah. I spoke before that about Mat Hayman and this French special that we did a couple of years ago. We're actually re-releasing that for Paris-Roubaix this weekend. I recommend listening to it while watching the race in 2016. It's really interesting to hear Hayman's commentary on it. And I mentioned Matt Keenan and Robbie McEwen's excellent commentary from as part of the episode too. But we're re-releasing that for friends of the podcast. So anyone who's signed up as a friend of the podcast will get that in their feed. And we're also releasing a new Friends special next week to coincide with the anniversary of the Amstel Gold Race. It was won in such sensational fashion by Mathieu van der Poel. So it's a special called MVDP, and it's about Mathieu van der Poel. But a large part of it is an interview with his father, Andrei van der Poel. who was a great rider in his own right. And I went to visit him in late February, just before lockdown, and spent a really interesting hour or so in his company, hearing all about his career and also Mathieu van der Poel's career. We'll hear a bit more about Van der Poel from some of the people around him in that episode too. But when I was watching the 94 Paris-Roubaix, there was Andrei van der Poel in that move as well, on that very muddy, filthy day. So he was a great rider and won a lot of these races. Never won Paris-Roubaix. And when I asked him, before we knew that the races were going to be postponed, when I asked him if there was one race that he really wanted his son to win, it wasn't Olympic gold medal or anything like that. It was Paris-Roubaix. So I think in future we're going to see Mathieu van der Poel really target that race.
I don't know about you guys, but just watching that 94 edition as well brought home to me what a big figure in the race's recent history Duclos-Lassalle was, and also how appealing this notion in Paris-Roubaix is of the guy who's the absolute specialist who has something in the way they ride, whether it's their pedal stroke or the way they sit on the bike, that's almost it defies sort of definition. It defies any understanding. You wouldn't see it on someone's power files, but it makes them ideally suited to Paris-Roubaix. And there's something that makes me lean more towards, in terms of thinking of mythical Paris-Roubaix figures, I lean more towards those guys. Maybe because I just love that idea of this, the sort of mystique of that. I think Franco
specialist.
I think Franco Ballerini was in that category again. Someone who had a good career and was up there in other cobble classics, but was never as good in other races as he was in Paris-Roubaix.
Andrea Taffy as well. Taffy was another one.
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah. But then I was also struck watching it by, we're going to hear from Steve Bauer in a moment, and he became a bit of a specialist in that race, but also, finished fourth in the Tour de France one year, and was quite an all-rounder too. And Greg LeMond, talk about handshakes, Daniel. The firmest handshake and the biggest, meatiest hands you will encounter belong to Greg LeMond. And he could, ride a decent Paris-Roubaix too. And when you watch the races in the 80s and 90s, you are struck by how many riders are up there who you would also then see up there in the Grand Tours too.
Just thinking about those specialists, another one who didn't have the same success as Duclos-Lassalle or Franco Ballerini, but one who I was very fond of was Dario Pieri, the Italian rider who I said earlier that Jef Braeckevelt was a bit like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Well, Dario Pieri at times was a bit like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man off season, when he hadn't really been paying too much attention to what he was eating. But I followed him quite closely over the course of a couple of years at Pro Cycling. Had a lot of problems with his weight, but I remember talking to Franco Ballerini about Dario Pieri, and he talks about that characteristic or that pedaling style that Pieri had, and a lot of other riders, the majority of other riders didn't have, and it was a sort of smoothness. And Ballerini likened it to riding on velvet, or it seemed like Pieri could ride on velvet. But Pieri's career, he finished second in 2003, and his whole career and his whole life really was based around Paris-Roubaix and trying to be ready for Paris-Roubaix. I remember he had two dogs, two spaniels. I think one was called Roubaix, the other one was called Bossberg, or Boss. But I remember going to see him just before his career completely went off the rails, and it was a spring 2005, I think, and we went out for dinner, and I remember him sort of triumphantly announcing that he was on a really, really strict diet now, and he wasn't allowed to eat pizza, I think it was, anymore. And he proceeded to order 2 Florentine steaks. And this was going to be his answer. This was to the question of this eternal problem that he had of keeping his weight in check, and it didn't work. And unfortunately, that was pretty much it for Dario Pieri.
You mentioned a lot of Italians, and again watching '94, Fabio Baldato out sprinting Ballerini in the velodrome. What is the the sort of Italian link to Paris-Roubaix. Why have so many Italians over the years, including Filippo Pozzato, seemed to perform well in Paris-Roubaix? Is there a reason for that?
Not really sure, Rich. Francesco Moser, of course, won three times in a row. I mean, we've talked about this issue of position on a bike before, and again, the sort of purist in me always likes to see someone win Roubaix with a classic sort of Roubaix bike setup, and what I mean by that is pretty aerodynamic, long on the long top tube, and I mean De Vlaeminck was like that, but Ballerini was certainly like that, and we've talked before about the contrast with someone who has a more sort of a mountain bike style setup, which would be a Peter Sagan, with hands on the top. And
Sagan famously could never win
Paris-Roubaix. But I wonder whether culturally, of course, up until 10, 15 years ago, all bikes, or the vast majority of bikes were custom made, and a lot of them custom made by Italian manufacturers, certainly for the Italian teams. I wonder whether there is something in the Italian frame building culture which led to riders having a position that was more set up for Roubaix, more adapted to that riding style.
Could just be body type as well. I mean, all those guys quite big. And Roubaix a race that would suit them.
Yeah, certainly the larger frame helps to absorb a bit of the shock from the cobbles. But ironically, when I rode the full route of the Paris-Roubaix in the Velo Club Roubaix edition of the cyclo-sportive, which is held every couple of years. In fact, it was due to be held this May, but has been postponed because of the coronavirus, of course. But it's held every couple of years and predates the kind of the newcomer, the Paris-Roubaix Challenge, which is run on the same weekend as the pro race. But when I rode it in 2008, I think I was probably the lightest I've ever been as an adult. But I'd probably needed a few extra pounds to get me through the last 50k because, I blew up pretty spectacularly in the final hour and a quarter. My memory of the last 50 kilometres is reaching the final feed station and stuffing my face with little pieces of French sausage, sort of salami style sausage, and bits of cheese. It was the first savoury food I'd eaten all day, and I was so sick of eating sugary stuff at all the feed zones, and of course the sort of the energy drinks and gels that I was eating that day. So it was savoury food. I was absolutely hoovering this stuff up. While my riding companion went to visit the bathroom, I fell asleep in a plastic chair for 10 minutes and had a glorious 10-minute sleep before we got back on the road and
so
finished the final 40k.
You started that Paris-Roubaix as the lightest you've been as an adult and finished it as the heaviest.
Yeah. It was a great day's ride though, and once this is all over, anyone who's ever thought, had even a half an inkling to go and do it, it's really worth riding. And I mean, we did the full route, 260 kilometres, and you get to appreciate that the first 100 and whatever it is to the first section of cobbles, it's billed as kind of flat, but it's not really. No. It's pretty rolling, and you needed to be in a good group to get over some of those lumps without making too much effort. I remember as we approached Troisville, the first section of cobbles, hammering along the road in a group of probably about 40, and I thought we were going pretty well, and another group of about 6 or 8 came past us. They were all wearing the same club jersey, a British club. I won't embarrass the club, but they came flying past, and then we sort of approached the cobbles, took the left-hand turn onto the first section of cobbles, and I got about 250, 300 metres onto the cobbles. I saw 6 of these riders all in the same jersey picking themselves up out of a ditch. I mean, it was a real lesson that you don't go flying into the cobbles as if you know what you're doing. Treat them with a bit of respect, because they can serve you up a nasty surprise. And I saw some amazing things that day. I overtook a guy quite near the end who was riding without a saddle. His saddle had snapped off. He just had his seat post sticking up, so he's riding out of the saddle. Goodness knows how he was.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Get to the velodrome, and yeah, a really tough and very rewarding day cycling. And still look back on that, even though it's 12 years ago now. Still look back on it as one of the best days I've had on a bike.
It's something Mat Hayman spoke about in that episode I mentioned, how tough those, the supposedly flat, it's very rolling, but quite hard, quite grippy. And before you even get to the cobbles, northern France, anyone who's got the Eurostar to Paris from London, it's very open, the land there, but and rolling, but deceptively hard, the roads.
You probably don't really get a sense of that on the Eurostar, though, do you? The grip.
Well, you see the landscape rolling. No, but you don't. What I'm saying is, you see this rolling landscape, and you don't really realise until you're on the roads how tough some of the hills are. It's the point I'm making, Daniel. Speaking of classic bike setups for Paris-Roubaix, somebody who didn't have one of those was Steve Bauer. You spoke to him recently, not about the very strange bike that he rode in Paris-Roubaix, Lionel, but one of the closest ever finishes in 1990.
Well, yes, indeed. It's great that we have Daniel here to fact check that the 1990 edition wasn't the closest between Eddie Planckaert and Steve Bauer. The 3 years later was slightly closer, was it, Daniel?
5 by 5 millimeters, I think.
Yeah, well, there we are. So, again, this is one of the great things about cycling, isn't it? You can have the closest ever edition of Paris-Roubaix, which isn't actually the closest. But yeah, I spoke to Steve Bauer about the second closest ever Paris-Roubaix. He these days is a sports director with the Team CCC, and he's currently in Canada at home waiting for the season to resume like the rest of us. But we had a very enjoyable half hour catching up on Paris-Roubaix in 1990. Well, let's start at the beginning, Steve. For some of our listeners who maybe don't know the story, how would you explain or describe the 1990 Paris-Roubaix?
Well, it depends whether you want to do the start or the finish, but it's the closest second place, I guess, for me in the history of Paris-Roubaix. I think there's quite a close sprint between Ballerini and Duclos-Lassalle, but I think the one between Planckaert and I was a little bit closer. I think it came down to like a half a centimeter or something like that. Unfortunately, I was on the wrong side of it.
Mais c'est l'intérieur qui va payer, oui. C'est l'intérieur qui va payer. Non, extérieur à droite, oui. C'est l'extérieur, c'est Eddie Planckaert, semble-t-il, devant Steve Bauer. Premier Planckaert.
Planckaert a coincé d'un seul coup, et là c'est bien difficile. Hein.
Je vois Planckaert devant Bauer.
But you've taken that defeat pretty well. I remember talking to you probably 10 years ago about that race, and you're pretty philosophical about the fact that it was so close.
Well, what can you do? I think I rode the best race, one of the best races in my career, and unfortunately the finish line just came up a little bit too quick, and I think we both threw our bikes too late, but obviously Planckaert's nose of his tire was there just a little bit too early for me. But overall, I think when I look at the way the race evolved, and it was sort of in the peak of my career, between sort of 88 and 90 was 88, 89, 90 were great years for me, and I just played the race tactically well. I bridged across to the leaders. In fact, Eddie had been in front for a long time, so he was on like a super day. He was very strong. And then when I got to the leaders, I was probably the strongest guy there, attacking on the Carrefour de l'Arbre. And, I just couldn't shake Eddie or Edwig, and, coming in the sprint, I was relatively confident, but I knew that Eddie was likely the fastest guy, statistically. And, a bit of track experience I got on the inside of Van Hooydonk coming through the final bend, and but Eddie just had a little bit more left, and that's the history of it.
What a finish we're going to have! They've got one more lap to go. Wampers leads. Planckaert's on his wheel. Good position here then for Planckaert to be on Wampers' wheel as they begin to wind it up now. Box down the inside, Gaillon, and up at the top. Bauer starts to go, but it's The blue colours from behind. Van Hooydonk is beginning to release an enormous fast sprint. He's gone for the long one. He's swept past them. Bar can't hold his wheel. Can Bar close up on him as Van Hooydonk heads down toward the finishing straight? And look at Plancard go over the top. He's gone straight to the top on the bank and zooming down. But Bar's in the lead. Bar's going for it. Pushing those pedals and he's rushing for the line. He throws his bike at it. Oh, I don't know whether Bar or Plancard got that one. It was so close. We shall have to have a photo finish for that one.
Well, let's roll back a little bit, because obviously in '86 you had a really good tour. In '88 you had an absolutely outstanding tour, and I mean, people thought of you more perhaps as a tour rider than a classics rider, but you were no slouch on the cobbles either, were you?
No, I mean the races of Flanders and again Wevelgem, Paris-Roubaix. Those were the sort of core classics that were to my my style, my ability. I lived in the region in West Flanders, so I had the opportunity to know the terrain really well, which is also an advantage or also an asset that's important in those races. Yeah, and I did well in Flanders. I think I was fourth a couple times, or at least once. I was very close. I was solo in 1986, and Sean Kelly and Adrie van der Poel came to me, at 4K to go, and I basically left out everything on the road to get to the finish into a fairly strong headwind that day.
En Bauer zal dus worden gegrepen door Kelly, Van den Brande en Adrie van der Poel. Op een bepaald moment helemaal dus.
So I got close. I got close to winning those races, but never won on the top step. So unfortunately, that's sport, right?
That is sport, yeah. I mean, tell me why you chose to live in West Flanders and whereabouts you based yourself.
Well, at the time when after the Olympics in Los Angeles, I moved into Europe and turned professional. And Greg LeMond had a base in Kortrijk, so he lived there. And Phil Anderson was another Anglophone living in Watergem. And so Doug Shapiro and I, we both turned pro and sort of moved into that region, mainly because we'd trained with Greg and Phil sort of the previous year. And so it was logical to kind of go where, other people were. Eventually, Doug Otto Lauritzen moved up from France to Belgium, and, Doug Erik Pedersen from Denmark. So we had a pretty core group of, English speakers, sort of speak, no pun intended, that formed a group of training partners and friends in the area.
And did you like it? Did you like living in that part of the world?
Yeah, I really enjoyed Flanders. I mean, and still to this day, I find that the Flemish people, or Belgians in general, very, very friendly, very open-minded, kind people that fortunately for cyclists are very generous. They love cycling, they love the sport. It's kind of one of their top passions, obviously. And so it's an easy sort of transition to be in that region, because people are helpful and they like cycling.
Did you have a fan club? Often the people will adopt foreign riders, won't they?
I actually did, yeah. So in the town of Gullegem, where there's actually a fairly nice bike race that happens annually now. I know Greg Van Avermaet and some of our guys go and do it. So in Gullegem, there was a cafe called the Stadium, which is right across the street from the football pitch. And the owner was also my landlord, so I had rented a ferment from him. And they had a cafe restaurant. The children eventually took over the restaurant, but the cafe was open until just recently, where Jenny Cotton finally closed it down as the still surviving bartender that had been there forever. So just last year, she finally retired, which was pretty amazing.
Wow, so that was your fan club base, and did you, when you lived in that region, I mean, how often would you go and check out the actual climbs of the Tour of Flanders, and how often would you go the other way into France and make a trip down to check out the cobbles? Was it something you did very often?
Probably a little bit less so to go down to do Paris-Roubaix recon. That was usually sort of once a year like they do now, the week prior, doing a quick recon. But, I can recall going down specifically once in a while just to ride the final. But obviously living in West Flanders, going out and doing, Kemmelberg over the Wevelgem Way and some of the climbs of, Col de Chat and the Black Mountain and all those little climbs over there was kind of fun region to train, very quiet, or into the Flemish Ardennes, and, often not really getting into the cobbles that often because, they beat you up pretty good if you train on them all the time. But there's lots of little climbs in Flanders that were enjoyable or they're do intervals on, and the one that reminds me the most is the Côte de Trieux there, just on the other side of the Clermont, because it's quite steep. It was a good section to do some repeats, and we used to call it Phil's Hill, Phil Anderson, Phil's Hill, because he was the one that did the most intervals on that hill, so we called it Phil's Hill. If
it was today, he'd have the Strava, would he, on the Côte de Trieux?
He would have the Strava on Phil's Hill for sure.
So 1990, you're riding, I think, second year with 7-Eleven by this stage. The big North American team, I mean, technically a USA team, but must have felt like a home team for you as well.
Yeah. Actually, 1990 was my first year with 7-Eleven. 89, I was with Helvetia and Paul Coakley's group still. So 90 was my first year, and it was. I had this question once before. It was quite an easy transition. I knew the guys competed against all the guys for, the majority of my amateur career and, also professional. But it was a nice transition and a new flavor to be part of that group and actually be also be one of the leaders in the group, which was nice. And, the 1990 Tour de France was obviously a memorable one, and using, the famous attack from the gun on the split stage that worked really well that day.
Well, this breakaway is absolutely flying. The latest time check now, they are 8 minutes ahead, and Pensek has been given a gift here. The main field have made a terrible mistake, even though it is the first morning of the Tour de France. Steve Bauer, too, fourth in this race 2 years ago, a former wearer of the leader's yellow jersey, and he's gone clear. This has been one of those snip little breakaways that you dream of, and Bauer is now going to give it its all. The 7-Eleven team will be delighted.
Kipuchi, Moss, and Pensek and I, we took, I think the majority of the gap was of almost like 14 minutes at one point, maybe 12, 13 minutes. In front of the peloton on stage one, so that was a pretty good feeling.
Can you remember any of the teammates who would have been on the start line with you at Paris-Roubaix that year? I'm just going through the team lineup here. See if
1990.
In 1990 for 7-Eleven at Paris-Roubaix.
I think probably Yates would have been there. Laritzen. I wonder. Like Norma Alves, maybe.
But in terms of going into battle against the Panasonic team, I mean that they were the big classics team of the time, weren't they, or one of them? And Eddie Plancart, of course, rode for Panasonic, but you couldn't just watch one rider in Panasonic, could you? They were a bit like, I suppose, De Koning Quickstep are in the classics these days.
Yeah, no, true. I recall that. That sort of early part of the final when Eddie was away and you're going into the last 30 kilometers and I'm pretty sure Panasonic still had a couple guys in that group. Laurent Fignon was super strong and doing a lot of the attacking to bridge. And I think I timed my sort of move fairly well after one of his his attacks. Like, he was very strong. And fortunately for me, he was, because I think he kind of opened up and softened up to all the guys and allowed me to get away and get across. So
there's been a small group split off the front, and Fignon again caught napping and now having to put his head down to close the gap. But look at this effort. There's nobody grabbed his wheel. They're all trying. And again, Johnny Tarlin, who has marked him out of it, has come back right up to him, Luck, and freewheels onto his back wheel. But Fignon has crossed the gap, and I'm not too sure who those riders are just now, but we'll find out in a minute. There's a general regrouping, but this big group is getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, good memories, but they definitely had a few guys in there. Wampers caught us on the track, so he was one of Eddie's teammates that was in the final, and I think John Tollin, another big tall Dutchman, I think John Tollin was, that was in that final.
Tell me a little bit about your bike, because you're on an Eddie Merckx bike, weren't you, the team, but there was something from memory slightly different about your Paris-Roubaix bike.
Oh, I tried this really, kind of wonky position. One gentleman in Belgium is actually a brother of Noël Dianca, Richard, had seen or sort of reviewed a position that a cyclotourist was using into very, very beneficial strength position, like which was far back and, use your hamstrings a lot more and the wheelbase is a lot longer. So it sort of really, really changes your attack on the crank system, which allows you to have more power through the hamstring and maybe an extended stroke. And for Roubaix, it was actually quite good because the wheelbase of the bike was long and very comfortable, more like a Cadillac. And it actually worked. The problem is that you were limited to the versatility of the position that the bike now has. So it wasn't a complete waste of time. It was a very interesting try, and unfortunately, wasn't for every race. It was more for Roubaix, so it's kind of a one-off risk. It was interesting. Need to learn something.
Was it suitable because the course? I mean, it isn't flat, is it? That's one of the kind of the great myths of Paris-Roubaix. The first before you reach the cobbles, it's surprisingly rolling, isn't it? The countryside in that part of northern France. But you weren't having to do the kind of the short, steep climbs of, say, a Tour of Flanders. So you're able to kind of play around with the position on the bike a bit.
Yeah, it was really kind of for flat, false flat. The difficulty is in acceleration and standing was less versatile, but it was a very powerful position while seated. That's what I mentioned before, the limitations of kind of a one-way street. Seated, on cobbles was like, felt like a Cadillac in a very, very powerful position. But, accelerating out of turns or climbing, sprinting, it had its severe limitations.
So I know you described it before. You rode kind of the perfect race, but no kind of panic moments. You just kind of calmly picked your way through. Chose when to react to other people. Was it very much that sense of just trying to, almost like sort of Tarzan swinging rope to rope, making just judging your effort and judging when to put in some effort and when to just try and take advantage of other people?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of maturity and experience in Roubaix. So you get, and other one day classics races, being patient and sometimes taking some risk of not following attacks that may make it. I mean that's the sort of the balance of staying on the wheel and letting other guys do the work and follow the attacks. Then moving with everyone. I think, as I mentioned before, Fignon was really strong, but he was the one that was opening up the attacks most of the time, where everybody else was, the Panasonic guys were jumping on or bridging back because Eddie was in front, right? So they were controlling from behind the movement, and eventually when everybody's tired, I guess I just hit it at the right time and got across to the leaders. Van Hooijdonk had also gotten across, I think, just a bit earlier. So it's sort of, okay, now it's sort of now or never that you got to get to the front of the race. And then racing is different now. There's more control. There's more organization, so to speak, from the teams. I think the riders are overall better trained. There's the technology of applications and power meters and all kinds of systematic methods of training that are monitored, with coaches and I just think it's a tighter peloton than it was. If you watch the videos of the race in '90, it seemed like more attacking, more open racing, right? More sort of unpredictable outcome sort of thing.
Do you mean in the sense that you could get up to a group and then maybe fall back, but then still get back up to them? Because that's the sort of thing that's so difficult now. Once the elastic snaps these days, there's kind of no coming back, is there? Because whereas in those days it does feel like there's a lot more to and froing. A bit, the door never finally closed on people until sometimes right until the end of the race.
Yeah, no, it's true. Or often racing, maybe not necessarily the classic racing, but like stage racing, the race is controlled, so much. Okay, it's a sprint day, so it's the race is controlled. I guess it was to a certain extent in my time too, for sprint stages, but there just seems to be like a lot of patterned racing now, and it's hard sort of to be tactically creative and get out of that mold because like so many teams are in this kind of same pattern. That guy has this leader and this guy has that leader, and they're going to control the race for him until this climb, and then he's going to attack. And if you don't have the legs, you're not going to be able to follow. There's sort of some predictable approach to every race. I don't know if that makes sense, but everyone is. There's less variety. There's less. What the hell is going to happen today? Sort of racing. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think the race is going to go like this. It's going to go like that. It's sort of more patterned.
Everyone's kind of choosing from the same menu these days, maybe.
A little bit, and I think it's a little bit frustrating. It'd be nice to see, but you can't bend it. You can't bend it the way you want. It's just teams are organized. They have their leaders. They have their sort of patterns. For example, like in some classic races, that the strongest teams will say, okay, well, we'll let the smaller teams go in the breakaway, but we're not going to let anybody from De Koning go, or we're not going to let anybody from CCC team go, or we're not going to let anybody from Ineos go. We can't do that. If they try to get in the break, we're going to chase them down. And so inevitably what happens is 4 or 5 guys get away from some of the smaller teams, and then the World Tour teams control to a certain point, right? And then the race starts again as the final begins. And, so that kind of patterned, you wouldn't have, what was the Frenchman's name that would go for a long one?
Someone like Thierry Marie or something.
Yeah, Thierry Marie or who's the other guy that went for long breakaways? He won Flanders.
Joel Pellier. Oh, Jackie Durand.
Jackie Durand. Yeah, Jackie Durand. That stuff doesn't seem to happen anymore.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Thinking about the 1990 Paris-Roubaix, I mean, having a rider as powerful as Eddie Planckaert up front for such a long way out, I mean, that certainly wouldn't sort of happen these days.
Like nobody would do that and win and be able to win Roubaix now, because the teams are just like, you know, storming behind, and the pressure from like a 3-man breakaway going away from Forêt d'Armberg is just super unlikely that has any chance in hell to make it, you know.
Well, as Edward van Hooijdonk said of that day, he said either Planckaert was super, super good or he was going to kill himself. That was Van Hooijdonk's quote. And I wonder what you thought when you got your way up into the front group and then looking around and thinking, right, I'm here now. Now what? I mean, how did that all play out?
Well, you know, I was actually surprised how quickly I got across to the break. I maybe they were closer than I thought.
Voilà, il est là. Van Hooijdonk, on se retrouve donc avec Bauer, Planckaert et Van Hooijdonk, les grands noms. Les plus anonymes pour l'instant ont laissé la place aux stars, puisque Van Karlsburg et Van den Ecker ont pour l'instant, je dis bien pour l'instant, disparu sur cette très puissante accélération de Steve Bauer, le Canadien, avec Planckaert dans les roulettes, facile.
And when I caught them, it was still quite a ways to go. So, you know, I tried to encourage the break to go, you know, and not letting anybody come back, you know, like Fignon and others. So it's sort of a balance of, you know, working, but also keeping some gas for what you need to win the race. And when I got to Carrefour Larbe, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I knew the sectors pretty well, and I knew the lines to take, and I knew that I was strong. So I felt it was better to attack, like to put the pressure on there as much as I could. And that was the tactic that I thought was most beneficial. So I dropped most of the guys, but I just couldn't get rid of Eddie and Edwig. I think Edwig was hurting. He didn't have the full tank left, but Eddie managed to just stay pinned on my wheel.
Ce final, nous avons droit au match avec une attaque là du 3e larron. Steve Bauer sur la droite de la route, aussitôt pris en charge par Eddie Planckaert. Eddie Planckaert très frais. Derrière, le contre est pour Van Hooijdonk.
And even subsequent attacks, I tried to shake him. You know, he was right there, so it was hard to. At that point, it was after the Carrefour. It was hard to get rid of him.
It was a headwind, I think. Is that right?
It's possible. That I don't recall fully, but it might have been a headwind on Carrefour Larbe as you turn left and go, you know, toward the main road in the center of the sector. That section there is unfortunate. I mean, it's just what it is. But if I had a sort of a crosswind there, I might have been able to get rid of them.
Well, I only ask because it was 7 hours 37 minutes was the time you guys hit the line.
Wow.
34.8.
Yeah, no, that makes sense then. Yeah,
but I mean,
north wind.
Slow, but by no means easy.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that time probably gets used up in the first, you know, 150 Ks if in the general direction heading north. Obviously, the peloton wouldn't be, you know, too aggressive if it was blowing from the north.
Were you concerned about Planckaert's sprint because he was a bunch sprinter? I mean, I know he'd won the Tour of Flanders, but he'd won the green jersey in the Tour de France as well, and he had a real reputation as a bunch sprinter.
Yeah, for sure. I knew Eddie was the guy to beat. There's no question that, and that's why I tried to, you know, attack several times, and from the Carrefour to the velodrome to try to get loose and go solo. Like, I didn't really want to come to a sprint with Eddie if I didn't have to, but obviously when it is what it is.
À l'annonce du retour de Martial Gaillan, et on accélère encore en tête, on sent le danger. L'accélération est de Steve Bauer, Eddie Planckaert dans sa roue, Van Hooijdonk qui pioche beaucoup. Qui a du mal, Van Hooijdonk.
And in the velodrome, I made sure when I entered to go up high so I could see everything going on. And then the other two riders joined us and took the front, which was fine. And if I remember, I was kind of watching over my shoulder because Edwig kind of he kind of tucked off the back a little bit to get a run at us down the back straight, and I read that really well. And that was my cue to go and not really worry about Eddie anymore. Just go for it. And I went underneath Edwig, and Eddie went over top, and the rest is history.
But Bar's in the lead. Bar's going for it, pushing those pedals, and he's rushing for the line. He throws his bike at it. Oh, I don't know whether Bar or Plancott got that one. It was so close. We shall have to have a photo finish for that one.
Well, what did you think when you hit the line?
I didn't know what to think. It was like the flash of the photo finish kind of went off, and it was sort of like, wow, okay, nobody knew who had won. I mean, that was certain.
So here we go again on that slow motion. Let's have a look at it. And I wouldn't like to bet on the result. Bauer on the right, Plancott on the left. They both throw the bike at the line, and that definitely will be a side-on photo finish. We can't spot it from our commentary position here at all.
It was just sort of like a wishing game then, like whose tire got to that line first.
Did you and Eddie have a word once you'd crossed the line and come to a halt?
No, I don't think we did. No, I don't remember that. I don't recall that at all. No. But obviously it's the agony of defeat when you hear the result, though.
But there was quite a wait, wasn't there? I think 10 minutes or so while the jury looked at the photo finish.
Well, good thing. I think it was important that they got it right. And Noël Dianquera was my director that day, and he saw the photo, and subsequently I saw other photos, and news or whatever. Yeah, it was definitive. And not very much.
Well, there is the photo finish result. It was a win for Plancott, with Steve Barr in second place, Van Hooijdonk third, Marshall Gaillon in fourth, and Pampers in fifth place.
So what was your reaction that evening? I mean, how, losing Paris-Roubaix, this is always the quandary when describing it, really, because when it's so close, does it feel more like a defeat than if you been beaten by a bit more of a margin? I mean, to get so close.
You know what? I don't think so. Actually, it's a good question, but I don't think so because, the only regret I could say that I have is that, and this may sound strange, but my track experience sort of, I believe, went against me. It was for me and against me because my instinct to go under Edwig, because he left the door open, was an asset. So he left the door open. I took the short line, and that was my chance to win the race. But then the second part was, I was sensing that the line was further down the stretch, and the reason for that is, Roubaix is a big velodrome, right? And the line comes up quick on that straightaway. There's a long banking, short straight, which a lot of velodromes, the banking is sort of tighter, or at least in those days, and then you have a straightaway, and the finish is usually entering the next banking, and I was just kind of sensing that it was further down the stretch, and that's why the bike throw was too late. My bike throw was too late, and so was Eddie's, in fact, but, maybe he was just thinking about it sooner. I don't know.
And have you ever watched it back? Have you? Is it one of those ones that you prefer not to watch?
No, I've seen it a couple times. I mean, yeah, it's just something that it pops up once in a while. Just like the sprint with Claude Criquelin at the Worlds and Rollins, that one always comes up once in a while too. So those are historical sprints that inevitably will rest as history, and that's the way it is. I was second, and unfortunately, one of the best races I rode in my career wasn't just quite enough to win, and that's sport.
But people still talking about it 30 years on, and I'm convinced people will enjoy listening to you talk about it 30 years on. So if you'd been
there you go. It's the most famous second place in the history of Paris-Roubaix.
Hey guys, it's Mitch Docker here, and the latest episode of Life in the Peloton is out, and it features Zwift Academy winner and now Canyon SRAM rider Ella Harris. It's on the Cycling Podcast channel every fortnight. And if you haven't heard the episodes before, go back and check out this season's episodes. I've got Andrei Tchmil on there, Luke Durbridge, Matt Keenan, and Jimmy Whelan, and also my coach Kevin Polton was the last episode. So go back and check that out on the Cycling Podcast feed. If you want to hear this new little segment I've got going on, it's called Talking Luft. It's a bit cheeky. It's a little 10-minute episode with all my guests that I've got on the Cycling Podcast. I've just got them for another 10 minutes. So go across to my feed, Life in the Peloton, and while you're over there, check out some of the back catalogue. Some great episodes there from the last 4 years with other pro riders and different types of cycling personnel, just explaining what life is like in the peloton. So subscribe to my feed, obviously subscribe to the Cycling Podcast. I hope you enjoy the show. Plenty more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Mitch Stocker. See you guys.
Hey guys, been a few days since I've checked in, but you're back in lockdown with Larry. Yeah, I guess there's just not been a whole lot going on for the last days. Just kind of been getting into the rhythm and the routine here. Been training pretty decently, a bit on Zwift and a bit outside, depending on the weather. So yeah, I actually haven't minded it too much. But yeah, it's just kind of like going through the motions for the moment because we don't really know when we're going to start. You know, there's some rumors here or there. But yeah, so watched the Flanders lockdown today. That was pretty interesting to watch. I actually found it pretty funny and entertaining. The best part was, I think, just having the video cameras on the guys and just seeing them really suffering on their trainers because they were all going pretty much as hard as they could go. So, yeah, it was pretty funny. And, yeah, I actually thought it was a good laugh. But, you know, interesting to watch. I don't think the system looked like the highest quality. But yeah, it was a nice idea. I think it brought together a lot of people who are sort of craving something to watch in terms of cycling. So that was kind of cool to see. Happy to see my teammate Ollie get up there for second. And yeah, it was pretty funny to see even like Matthews ended up having mechanical and dropped out of the race. So that was all pretty fun to watch. But yeah, I guess over the last week or so, I've, been checking in with some of my friends in Europe, and I think a lot of the guys who are really stuck inside are struggling a bit. It's definitely not easy when you can't go outside, and I think for, a lot of us, riding's our only really sort of social interaction in the day. So if you can't go ride with your friends, it's tough to, it's a tough situation to be in. So I'm really hoping, I read today that in France they're going to petition to be able to start riding outside from the 15th of April, and I think that'd be a really good move for the pros, at least, just to be able to get outside. So, I guess we'll see what happens, but I'm hopeful for them because otherwise it'll be a really hard time on your head. And yeah, it's a nice thing is here we've been able to get outside, and I've been going for an evening walk with my little sister, and then some good rides during the day. So all in all is well at the Warbest household, and still here. Hope you all are well, and talk to you soon.
Well, that was Larry Warbass with his latest dispatch from being locked down. He's back home in the US. Where
I always get confused.
Yeah, sorry, Daniel.
I always get confused when he says he's in Michigan. I was sure that Lucky Larry was from Texas.
No, very much not. He is from Michigan in the freezing sort of Midwest, and the restrictions there are very much less than in certain other parts of even America, but certainly Europe. And his teammate Oliver Nassen at AG2R in Belgium has run into, well, he's got some criticism for posting big rides that he's been doing on Strava. So he's made his Strava account private now, because there's this, the inconsistency, I suppose, around the world about whether people are allowed to exercise inside or not. And in some parts of the world, riders can go out on their bikes, and they're allowed to do that. Their government allows them to do that. And in other parts of the world, they're not allowed to do that. And there's a view held by some that everybody should be respecting the stay-at-home policy that is in place in some parts of the world. I'm not sure what I think about that, really. I'm not sure that Oliver Nassen shouldn't go out because in other parts of Europe you're not allowed to go out. I don't know what you guys think about that.
It's a difficult question, Richard. I think that you have to say that the advice from, or the instruction from respective governments has to take precedence, surely. That's the rule everyone should be following. I do think that there's a personal responsibility to bear, though. In the UK we have the flexibility to go out and exercise once a day. It's quite a vague. It's quite a vague criteria, that, isn't it? What one person's exercise once a day might be a half-hour walk. Somebody else might think, I'm going to go and do my 4-hour training ride. And I don't know what I think about that. Personally, all I can do is assess risk and take the decisions that I want to take. And my thing on that would be that I would go and do laps on my bike round the common where I live and be within sort of 5 minutes of home all points. I probably wouldn't go off and be an hour from home. That's just what I'm choosing to do. And it is difficult to lay down rules for other people if the government isn't setting and making the criteria clear enough for people.
Isn't it a maximum of an hour you're supposed to do here?
Not really. It's not really set in stone, though. Nassen's been doing like 300-kilometer rides. Well, I think I agree with you, Lionel. I'm not really sure what to make of it. But there you go. Oliver Nassen has made his Strava account private. That's one of the more trivial news stories of the week. In what continues as a major public health crisis and economic crisis and general crisis that the world is facing at the moment. And we, as in the last few weeks, we've decided to deal with all the news relating to the coronavirus at the end of the podcast. And so here we are. Larry led us into a little discussion on it. But what have been the major news stories from the world of cycling relating to this in the last week? Well,
all the racing is cancelled or suspended until the end of June at the moment, isn't it? And Christian Prudhomme has said in the French media that the Tour de France won't happen behind closed doors. It was Gazzetta dello Sport in Italy, I think, wasn't it, Daniel, that had some provisional calendar dates. And again, I kind of, this is just purely a personal thing. I'm finding the redrawing of the calendar now, when we're so uncertain about what may or may not be possible and when, finding that quite mentally exhausting. But the idea is to, as Gazzetta has reported, and if this is correct, the idea is to push the Tour de France back a month, so start in late July, then run a kind of truncated 2-week Vuelta, certainly without the bit in the Netherlands, which was supposed to be the start, then the World Championships, and then the Giro d'Italia from October the 3rd. Again, possibly, I'm not sure, Daniel, whether that would include the Hungarian start or not, or whether they would go straight to Sicily. The details are not really set in stone, because nothing can be set in stone at the moment, and it wouldn't be a surprise if all of these types of plans get pushed back and altered as the weeks go on. So I'm certainly not sort of pinning my hopes on something that is being floated as a possibility now. I don't know about you chaps.
No, certainly not. As we said last week, though, I also don't feel any great rush or hurry or pressure or need to pronounce on whether things should go ahead at this point. I think it's understandable that ASO in particular would give themselves as much time as they can to come up with an alternative or to just assess the situation, see how things are evolving. I mean, time is sort of either truncated or stretched out depending on which way you look at it. I mean, the sort of 3 weeks or 4 weeks worth of developments can happen in one day, so it's a very fluid situation. But I think what everyone does agree on is that the potential repercussions, if there is no racing or if there are no Grand Tours, would be terrible, would be disastrous. And in fact, even now, even in the last week or 2 weeks, we've seen some of the fallout really come to bear on at the top of the sport, at World Tour level. I mean, we're not talking about continental and pro-continental teams that are suffering only them. We're talking about the richest teams in the sport.
I'll come on to the teams in a mo. I did speak to a rider for our forthcoming Giro coverage yesterday, and he made a point that I hadn't really considered, which was perhaps when we do come to piecing together salvaging something from the 2020 season, priority ought to be given to races that it might be sort of 50-50 whether they could survive, rather than, I mean, the specific point he made was Paris-Roubaix can survive. The Paris-Roubaix won't disappear from the calendar if it doesn't happen in 2020. The same could go for other monuments and some of the other big races. But there might be some events that would desperately need to be run in order to get broadcasting revenue and sponsorship revenue that might not make it if they don't get held. And that was a kind of a reverse way of looking at the whole situation, which I hadn't really considered at all up to this point. I kind of assumed that the appetite will be to get the biggest events on whatever time is available later on in the year. I don't know what you think about that, but it kind of seems to make sense to me to try to protect and prop up some of the more vulnerable events rather than some of the others that will get through this no matter what.
I think that you can definitely make that case, Lionel. I mean, I've spoken to other people involved in teams who take the opposite position and see this as almost an opportunity, a very painful opportunity, but that has been sent cycling's way to sort of trim a lot of the fat and the flab in terms of races that don't bring in any money, teams that are barely surviving, and to streamline cycling and to really sort of realise the dream that was demonised in a lot of ways, but the dream that the likes of Hein Verbruggen, the former UCI president, had of making professional cycling a lot more like Formula One, for instance, a sort of closed shop system with a small number of races, a small number of teams, but it very much being about the elite.
Yeah, the problem with teams, and I think you're going to mention, Lionel, some of the measures that some of the teams have taken already, but the problem cycling has in the way that the teams are funded is they are marketing vehicles for companies, and if there are no races, there is no need for a cycling team. And at a time when a lot of companies are having to cut costs, marketing costs are the first thing to go, aren't they, a lot of the time? So I think inevitably some teams will be a casualty, whether that's just a short-term thing or whether it lasts, who knows. But as long as there are no races, there's not a lot of reason to have some of these teams. And I mean, in terms of the scale of the crisis, that's an unknown. We don't know what, if anything, will be salvaged from this year to help safeguard some of those teams. But I mean I'm not sort of looking for a silver lining here at all, because there isn't one. But I do feel that cycling has kind of been through, in a way, something even worse, which was doping. And I'm not saying it's through doping, but in 2006, 7, 8, when doping scandals and doping cases were threatening to overwhelm the sport, sponsors were vanishing, and it certainly didn't look like new sponsors were going to come in, and why would they? I thought at that time the sport really faced a proper existential crisis in professional sport. And I think it could be on a similar scale this time around, just with the state of the world economy. But that won't be a problem specific to cycling, whereas it was in 2006, 7, 8.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rich, in the sense that all sports and anyone competing for marketing budgets in companies is pretty much in the same position. The crisis is sort of democratic in that respect, and whereas with the doping issues and the doping crisis, it was very much sort of cycling's prestige and cycling's marketability that was affected when other sports prestige and how attractive they were was not diminishing. And I suppose in the same way that in economic terms, the one virtue perhaps is that this crisis is affecting everyone in a very similar way, and it's not necessarily about one country or one area of the world gaining a sort of competitive advantage which can be brought to bear in negative ways on another part of the world. We hope, at least.
Well, the teams are coping, and they are making changes, particularly when it comes to staff costs and rider salaries, aren't they? Last week, I think we mentioned that Lotto Soudal had reduced the riders' salaries temporarily while there's no racing going on. Astana's riders had agreed to take a 30% pay cut, although there had been some suggestions at the start of the year that they were being paid late anyway, before any of this struck. In the past week, we've heard that Bahrain McLaren will be deferring 70% of their riders' wages while there's no racing going on. The CCC team looks to be in difficulty as well, or rather the company that sponsors the team is having trouble. Polish shoe making company, they've suspended from work the majority of the support staff and are reducing rider salaries. And Mitchelton Scott's riders on both the men's and women's World Tour teams have taken what's been described as a substantial pay cut to keep the team going through this period. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the World Tour teams that have already made public the fact that they're reducing rider salaries and staff salaries, and in some cases putting staff effectively on gardening leave, I guess, while this is going on. So that's a quarter of the World Tour hit pretty dramatically already, and it's such a difficult situation, isn't it? We've seen that companies across the board are going to have to cut costs while they have no income coming in. And professional cycling, as you say, Richard, while there's no marketing return on the investment, it's not a surprise that the team's income streams will be hit, and some will be hit more long term than others. It doesn't look like anyone is going to be invulnerable to this, although if you listen back to our interview with Jonathan Waters a couple of weeks ago, he did make a rather pointed remark about how the fracking teams would probably be okay to weather this. I'm not sure who he's referring to there. It's the one that surprised me, I suppose, is not surprised me, but I mean Bahrain is getting its income from a state, isn't it? And I do wonder what is being impacted there, really. I mean, it's is there a commercial concern there? I mean, it's a state that is sponsoring the team, I guess.
Yeah, it's an odd one, that. But we're seeing it. I mean, we're seeing it across all sports as well, Formula 1 and football too. A word for Mikel Landa, though, of Bahrain McLaren, for the excellent video that he posted on is it TikTok they call it, Daniel? Is that what the kids call it?
I think so. I'm not a user of TikTok.
Mikel Landa, it features Mikel Landa, a turbo trainer and an axe, and I do urge you to look it up.
I think we've all felt that about a turbo trainer at some point or another, haven't we? To be honest.
It's brilliantly done. It's very well done.
There is some good news stories coming out, and one that caught my eye was that Team Ineos rider Luke Rowe replaced a bicycle for an NHS staff member who'd had his bike stolen while he was working a shift at the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff. I mean, that's a nice thing to have done, and there are other stories of that ilk out there. Good.
Some other
Luke.
Good news.
I wonder what he got. Did he get him a Pinarello Dogma? I wonder. Now the guy's riding to work on a Pinarello Dogma.
Not sure about that.
Some other good news, chaps. A friend, colleague of ours, Andrea Agostini, who is one of the press officers at the UAE Emirates team, believe it or not, he had been stuck in the UAE So following on from, where the crisis started and when it started as far as cycling was concerned. So at the end of February, he was there until yesterday, and he has finally got home to, I think he lives in Cesenatico. He was a good friend of Marco Pantani, the late Marco Pantani, Andrea, but he's made it back. He's been through a real ordeal there in the Emirates with the two UAE Emirates riders, Riqueza and Gaviria, and then members of staff, and then Andrei himself. I think he had, in the end, he ended up having about 15 or 20 tests, coronavirus tests, and eventually enough of them were coming back negative for him to be allowed to go home, at which point there were no flights back to Italy, and he was waiting for a number of days just for something to be arranged, a flight to be arranged for the Italians stuck out there to get home. But he is now home.
Lionel, shall we hear from a young rider making his debut this year with Trek-Segafredo, and being stopped in his tracks like everybody else? You spoke to him last week.
Yeah, young Charlie Quarterman. To be honest, calling him young Charlie Quarterman, I mean, everyone's quite young to me, but Charlie Quarterman's 21 years of age and turned pro for Trek-Segafredo, as you say. Before Christmas, you may remember my interview with Flavio Zappi, who runs the development team in his own name, and I met him at the Rafa Cafe in Bicester and managed to spill coffee all over Flavio and Charlie Quarterman's dad, who was also there. Quite an embarrassing moment of last year. But Charlie Quarterman started the season well. As I said earlier, he had a very good first day at the Tour de la Provence and ended it with the King of the Mountains jersey and the Best Young Riders jersey. And then, of course, his season, as everyone else's did, came to a halt after, for him, it was after the UAE Tour. So here is a little bit of the conversation I had with Charlie Quarterman earlier this week. We will actually put the whole of the interview on our website, thecyclingpodcast.com. Just click on latest episodes and go to the page that relates to this episode, and we'll just put the file of the whole conversation on there, because it is almost 20 minutes and we haven't got time to play all of that in the episode. But if you'd like to hear more from Charlie Quarterman, it will be on the website.
I did 3 stage races to start the season, which were, there was the Étoile de Bessèges, the Tour de la Provence, and then the UAE Tour. So it's a lot of days of racing in the legs in my first month of professional racing, and yeah, it's pretty good actually. It's in some ways it was as I expected. With I know I'd spent enough time asking questions to my teammates and the people I know in cycling, and yeah, you can get a vague idea of what it's going to be like how when it's going hard, it's really hard, and you also have a lot of hours riding really, really easy. So it wasn't a complete shock, but yeah, as you can imagine, it is very different in some ways. And the fight in the peloton is like nothing else. The contact you have with other riders, and the speeds you go through corners and through small towns, and all the thought behind everything you do that is required to do well is quite amazing, really. So yeah, I think I took to it fairly well, but there's a lot to get used to and a lot of changes to to get used to. Yeah.
Well, tell me about the Tour de la Provence, because you had an absolutely fantastic opening day.
Yeah.
Got into the break, ended up with 2 trips to the podium. I think the Best Climbers jersey and
Young Riders.
Also the Young Riders jersey. A beautiful race in some really pretty areas of the south of France.
Yeah.
Well, it must have been great. Tell me who your companions in the break were, if you can remember, and how it came about.
Well, that's a bit of a tricky one. I remember one of them was a Swiss rider called Johan Jacobs or something from Movistar, and he was a really strong guy to be there with, as well as 2 French riders from smaller teams. But yeah, I guess it was surprisingly easy to get in there. I'm not going to say it was completely down to skill and it was all planned and I knew exactly what I was doing, but in a way I rolled off the front at a good pace at the right time over the top of a small climb. Started riding with a Pro Conti rider from France, and 2 guys came across to us, and we let go. We weren't really allowed much time throughout the day, so it was quite a long day riding at a decent pace, and never really able to relax. But no, it was quite nice. It was a really quite stress-free day, and riding in good country and on good roads. It was actually just enjoyable. It was like a normal fast ride in the countryside, and not really suffering until the last hour. But
was it something that was discussed in the team earlier on, in before the race? Who was your sports director, and was it a kind of a green light for anyone who wanted to go in a break, or was certain of you given a license to go up the road?
It was a green light. We had Jaroslav Popovic and Greggy Rast, so 2 young but experienced sports directors, and they just said, we haven't got any big GC guys here. So everyone has a bit of a free roll throughout the whole race, and with the way the first stage was, it just gave an opportunity for a rider like me to show something in a quite high profile race. So once I did give it a bit of a go to get the breakaway, it was all eyes on the King of the Mountains jersey. So I ended up, I think, in the sprint for the mountains points, I reached like 201 beats per minute. In the last few seconds, so it really was all out for that, and then just focusing on everything else after that. But it's nice that in such a big team you still get the opportunity every now and then to do what you want and make an impression.
And remind me, what colours are the 2 jerseys that you picked up that day, and where are they now?
The KOM jersey was white with blue spots, which I wore the next day, and the Young Riders jersey was a green and red one, which I was actually fairly happy not to be wearing the next day. It didn't suit me that well. But now they're in a drawer in my room, and I'm still trying to work out what to do with the jerseys that I'm quite proud of. It's unfortunately, well, it's a good problem to have, but I've got quite a few jerseys that I'd like to have up on the wall, but I don't want to cover my house with frames with my own things, really.
Well, keep your powder dry as well. You never know what sort of jerseys might come along when the racing resumes as well. You don't want to go too early.
Exactly. They all seem massive at the time, but so far in my career, it's always got bigger from here. So, I keep a space.
So then the next race was the UAE Tour. Obviously, a step up in terms of the riders that were around you in both your own team, but also in the peloton as a whole. Yeah. But of course, we now know. I mean, the shadow of this coronavirus was kind of was lurking, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Were you, when you got on the flight to go over there? Was this anything can you remember if you'd even heard that there was a virus that had sort of come out from China and had made its way to Italy? I think it was just about getting into the news at that stage, wasn't it? But do you remember if you were aware when you were heading over there?
Yeah, I remember talking about it for the whole time while I was in France, actually. But as always with this sort of thing, or what I've experienced of this sort of thing in the last 20 years or so, is that it seems like a massive thing at the start, and also feels like something that's miles and miles away would never make it over. So although I was aware of it and aware of how easily it spreads, I never really considered it as something that would stop the racing or anything that would endanger my trip to the UAE. So when I was going over there, all thoughts were on the racing, really. It's amazing how fast it changes.
How was the racing in the first few days?
It was tough in an unusual way, in several unusual ways. Really, trying to deal with that heat in February after spending most of the winter in the UK is incredibly difficult, especially when you're a rider as big as me with a little bit of insulation, I don't mind saying. The heat was really tough to deal with, and also the style of the race is so different, being on such big roads and always rolling along at a good speed, even with hardly pedaling. So we'd end up like spending most of the day at a slow endurance pace, and then the last 10-15 kilometers would be unbelievably fast. So I mean, it's just hard to deal with, really. It's just quite an unusual situation for us. Well, for me anyway, for the first time. I think that's not really how World Tour racing normally is, with it being quite that extreme. But I guess it's also a nice way to get myself introduced to that sort of level when it's not when I'm not worried about being dropped in the first 50 kilometers.
So that was Charlie Quarterman of Trek-Segafredo, and as Lionel said, if you want to hear the whole interview with him, you can go to the website, thecyclingpodcast.com. You can also go to the website, thecyclingpodcast.com, if you want to sign up as a friend of the podcast. Thanks to everybody who has. And you will, for this weekend, have Mat Hayman talking through his 2016 Paris-Roubaix win there. And next week, the release of our latest new Friends special, the subject being Mathieu van der Poel. And it opens with a voice message from one of our listeners, Alton Coyle, who got in touch last year after the Amstel Gold Race to kind of chastise us for not having really seen Van der Poel coming, he alleged. So we hear Alton's charge at the start of the episode and go on from there and hopefully learn quite a lot about Mathieu van der Poel in the course of the episode. Will we wrap things up for this week, chaps?
Well, you just said your lunch is ready.
My lunch is ready, so I should really go and have it. Well, you know how I became a vegetarian a few months ago?
Is this true? I've heard this rumour.
Yeah, I did become a vegetarian. It's not gone that well in the last couple of weeks.
Right.
Brilliant.
These are difficult times for somebody who is just trying to make things a little bit easier. So today, I think I'm having a nice piece of lamb.
I was going to say, is it a ham sandwich made with 2 steaks instead of bread?
Still avoiding processed meat, Lionel, but a bit of lamb. But I made a very nice aubergine curry last night, so all is not lost.
Talking of food, Napalm, were you aware that yesterday in Italy was Carbonara Day? National Carbonara Day.
Now, this feels like a trap.
No, it might turn into a trap, but I think we should discuss it on another occasion. Maybe, we've got a month of...
What, the rules of carbonara?
Well, we've got 3 weeks of podcast coming up when we...
everyone knows it's just a bit of pasta, a dollop of creme fraiche, and a bit of... and some onions and ham.
Where is carbonara from? Is it from Rome, Daniel?
Yeah, but I think we should get into this later. Napalm.
Well, I'm just wondering whether it can be on our culinary cookery spot that's coming up in our Giro coverage. Whether we can squeeze it in somehow.
I think we might be able to, but even the issue of where it's from might be contentious. So,
if the Giro is rescheduled for later this year, we'll I guess we'll end up doing 2 Giri.
We will.
Ah, brilliant.
Yep.
Wonderful. We're planning for our Giro coverage, aren't we? It's coming together, I think, quite nicely.
In my case, it's literally on the back burner as we speak. The cookery slots are being planned and prepped as we go. It's going to be the best thing about it, I think.
Oh, there's lots to look forward to in our Giro coverage, I think, one thing we're planning to do again, which we did last year, was to sell mugs. Stacey Snyder, the ceramicist in the US, is going to be making more Giro-themed mugs. Also, cappuccino cups and espresso cups. And they will be raising money for a very special good cause that we will announce nearer the time. But there's lots to look forward to in that. And in the coming weeks too. We'll be talking about something else next week, won't we? But we should wrap things up. Did you have anything else to add? I've asked this already. No? Nothing to add. Okay. Well, before we go, a big thanks to some of you who've signed up as good friends of the podcast. From me, a big thanks to Keith Elliott, to Simon Werity, Neil McLean, Pavel Silvovsky, Blair Oliver, Rowan May, Dill Davis, Andre Perret, Greg Stevens and Adam Cowmeadow.
And a big thank you to Bradley Dickerson, Chris Nicholson, Dale Preston, Blake Thompson, Vincent Giovinco, Tom West, Kenneth Peterson, Michael Taylor, Francois Cockerman and Mark Davis.
And from me, thanks to James Southern, John Kavanagh, Lee Hamilton, Tom Southern.
That is Tom Southern,
the
Tom Southern.
Wow. Paul O'Donoghue, Thomas Cooper, Tommy Cooper, David Lindsay, Owen. Oh, how do you say that? E-O-I-N. Is it Owen?
Owen, yeah.
Owen
Reddington, Tony Weeville, Christian Puckstead.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lionel.
Thanks, Richard. Just like that. You've been listening to the Cycling Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us and leave a review on Facebook and iTunes. Just search online for the Cycling Podcast. This episode was edited and produced by Adam Bowie.